Hey, Jonathan, it's incredible that you could come today to the Will Talks podcast. And this is actually like the first time I'm trying to do like a remote podcast. And I'm super excited that it's you. What do you think?
Yeah, super glad to be back, and I'm excited that we're finally trying out online podcasts, right? Because if we expect schools to go online, there's no reason why you and I shouldn't.
Exactly. And I think when we are going to do something like this online, we also have the opportunity to call so many people across the globe and so many new ideas we'll get. I wanted to pick your brain about something. Yesterday, I think over the phone, you told me the future of education may be parents. And I just thought maybe we should talk about that a little bit. And why don't you unbundle that for me?
Yeah, I think I need to unbundle it in my head as well, but was giving a thought as to how education's evolved over many, many, many years. And there was a time when the job of preschooling was handled completely by parents. And as more parents started to work, less people were available at home to cater to children, and preschools started to blossom. And very soon it turned from a essential aid into something that has to be done. Almost as certainly as your child has to go to school, your child had to go to a preschool. While it's not necessarily bad to go to a preschool, in fact, it's a great thing. I wonder whether the industry itself has evolved as rapidly as the need for schooling and preschooling evolved with it. And when you think about that, you see that for a long span of time, parents sent children to school and almost felt like the school's responsibility is to educate the child and give them back. And the essential role of parents in helping the development of the child, more on the cognitive side of things, started to dwindle, started to reduce, or at least in urban phenomena, we see that. While that started to change, a lot of parents are taking interest into education. They're asking questions. Schools are no longer black boxes or operating behind closed doors. And as parents get a glimpse of what's going on, they're getting more and more involved into children's education. They're questioning the school. And if the school's not able to adapt well enough, then they're considering providing that education themselves. You can see that from the blossoming of a ton of micro schools that have taken place. And the parents who send their children to micro schools or who homeschool their children really feel that no one else is going to be able to do as good a job of raising their child as them. And that's right. We're looking at education intertwined with the raising of children and not as something separate, not as a job that parents need to do to raise a child while at the same time a school works to educate a child. In fact, you now have both a parent and both a school playing the role of educating the whole child or nourishing the whole child. Schools need to get counselors, play the role of mentors and coaches at the same time. And parents, while they've always played this role, now need to start getting way more involved in education. So as this happens, we'll see schools becoming more of holistic support organizations, and we'll see parents becoming more of schools.
It's quite interesting what you say because, on one end, schools really want parents to be more invested in the educational process, right? Because they talk about trying to get parents more engaged. And I think throughout schooling, we see that in pre-primary or in primary, there's so much more participation from parents, the new parents, and it slowly starts to taper off as the kids get into secondary and things like that. So yeah, on one end, schools want parents to be more engaged. On the other hand, I'm thinking, do you see any change in behavior, or do you see that this behavior has been pretty much prominent right from maybe a couple of maybe 50 years or 75 years? Parents have always been highly invested in their own children's learning. I don't know if there are any experiences from healthcare or if there are any other experiences from the medical fraternity, but some parents that I've spoken to of children who are sick, and when I spoke to the mother or the father, many a times they've said that it was due to their own personal determination, their own personal research, tirelessly meeting different doctors and trying to find a good line of treatments for their own children. They were in a position to help their children. Now, by no means I want to say that the traditional hospitals and healthcare wasn't working, but taking an active interest in one's own personal journeys or one's own tribulations or challenges is very important, right? Because end of the day, that is so. I think that is also happening in education. Somehow from what you're saying, I'm also thinking, do parents really send their kid to school and absolve responsibility? I'm not sure. How does that look like? How does a responsible parent, or what kind of behaviors come through, you think? We're just chatting about that to try and figure out if we
So
can come up.
don't get me wrong, because when I talk about the changing parental involvement in the child, I don't mean that they neglected their child earlier or at any point, but in fact, I mean that parents have always had the best of intentions for their child, or at least that's what good parents are supposed to do. But the pathway by which they execute, okay, what they think is best for their child has changed rapidly. So someone may think that the best thing that they can do for their child is to send them to a tutor, or the best thing that they can do for their child is to say keep them in the company of good friends. Or another parent may say the best thing that I can do for my child is to take over this education system altogether. But I think you're absolutely right. As people have started asking questions and started to get more involved, you understand the different philosophies. And something very interesting happens when choice pops up, right? And you mentioned whether there's any connection to the healthcare sector. There's connections to a lot of sectors. So there's a psychological experiment that was conducted in an office space where they kept a vending machine with only one kind of drink. Let's say Coca-Cola for the sake of this example, right? And they noted the number of cans that sold. Let's assume 100 cans sold every day. And now at the side of that Coca-Cola machine, they put up another machine, let's say Pepsi, right? So people wanted to experience what exactly happens to the sales of these products. And one would think that maybe it now gets divided and you have 50 cans of Coke and 50 cans of Pepsi sold, or maybe slightly more, 60-60. But in fact, the total number of cans that were purchased nearly doubled. And that goes to say that when you have choice, your choice is not just split between A or B. Your choice, it becomes easier to make that choice. Now, does this work if you put up a third and a fourth and a fifth vending machine? Right? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves. Similarly, healthcare. You go to a chemist and you say, ask for Crocin, and the chemist says, no, I don't have Crocin. Will you take Dolo? You say, sure, and you take the Dolo, right? But you go to the chemist and ask for a Crocin, and he says, I don't have Crocin, but I have these 11 different kinds of paracetamols available for you, and starts naming them one by one. What do? You say, hang on, you start Googling, you call your doctor, you call someone else who probably knows what's going on. And so the moment choice increases beyond a certain amount, people don't just make the choice. They start learning about the choice that they're going to make. And that's what happens when you have so many new boards of education, new philosophies of education, pedagogies, or ways of not just teaching, but changing the meaning of teaching itself to be both teaching and learning, where there's mutual understanding. And practically everything that we know in the education system has evolved, has been documented, and written about in some way or the other, right? So now that this has become accessible, I think parents are just wanting to be more informed. But that leaves me with a question for you. So you have kids, you're in the education sector, and you're sending them to an online school, right? But you also tried the physical school and you run a set of schools. So just having access to all these different avenues, how have you thought about this as an educator and a parent, right? Where do you give your
I
time to your children and to everyone's children?
I certainly think that you know we as you said, we need different kinds of schools. We need different models. Um, we need schools of all sizes, all shapes, all price points. Um, and we certainly need a lot of different schools, because the idea is it's the idea is to find not the best school per se, but to find the most suitable school for what I believe my kids should get at this point in time. Because, kids are different. You have three kids and all three are different, right? And some may thrive in a system that another child may not thrive in. Right. So one way is for us to sit and blame the school and say, okay, the school is not able to serve every child. But Perhaps as a parent, I need to be able to study my own children and find suitability. But most of the time, I think suitability and convenience comes to where, when you're coming, when you stay in a city and logistics is a problem, you have a job to keep, then sometimes you want everything just as convenient as possible, right? So I think that's the trade off. Having said that, I believe as a parent today, all of us, I think, we are experiencing the AI revolution. So things are going to change so much. I think most of our schools, our exams, higher education, everything is optimized anyway towards employability. Right? I mean, I think after the industrial revolution, the institution of schools and the institution of learning organizations, I mean, these are all to bring employability into children, right? Now, if the very assumptions of what makes a person employable start changing, or if the very eligibility criteria start changing, or if HR managers and business owners start looking for other skills which may or may not be present in children today, then one starts wondering what is it that we were preparing for in some ways. So I think today everyone needs to have an active interest in education. Um, uh, and that I mean from a way of, even if you don't have kids, you should take an active interest in education, because perhaps you can support schools and organizations or families or communities by getting certain life skills out to children that may not be getting that in school. uh, Having said that, as a parent, I think all of us need to think how the world is changing, how technology is reshaping the world of work, right? I think the World Economic Survey or the World Economic Summit, I think they put a lot of research out and talks about what does work 5.0 look like? What are the skills that children need to develop? Education takes time, right? Reform in education takes time. So parents who actively take an interest in this could supplement and augment the skills that their own children learn, even when they're part of a traditional system. So, while there has been a lot of significance and importance given to formal education, I think parents also need to understand that very, very similar to nutrition. I think today, I think this has all got to do with the world, with the way the world is evolving. You could be eating a full meal and still be suffering with malnutrition, right? Like I don't think by the grace of God I've gone hungry, in the past month, but still my doctor tells me I don't have enough B12 or I don't have enough vitamin D. And I'm like, what? You're saying I'm malnutrition. And he's like, yeah, you're malnutrition. So I guess merely having experiences may not get the target. Does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah, I think I was shocked when I found out that you can have fruit without nutrition. It seems silly now in retrospect, but I always assumed that a plant will bear fruit or grain only if it had the adequate nutrition to do so, right? And that was revolutionary to realize that you can be eating but not be getting your nutrient supply. And I think that's such a good analogy because you can be going to school and not learning, and you can, as parents, be teaching your children but not teaching, right? You can be talking to your children, but if you aren't focused, if you aren't practicing the serve and return where you respond, you let them participate as well, it may just fall on completely deaf ears.
Which is incredible, right? Because the world is trying to move towards advancement to make life better, but we can eat without getting nutrition. We can be part of a learning system without learning. We can clear an examination without knowing. There are cases of people just dropping dead inside gyms, right? So you could be in a gym without. So I think that means all of us really need to deeply reflect time and again in terms of, are we really getting what we think we're getting, and are we expecting from people what we think they should be giving us, but maybe they're not giving, right?
So
So
I think you've touched upon such a perfect example because we never had to question certain things earlier, and by we I mean humanity. I wasn't around for very long. I wasn't around too long ago. But when the only way to produce food was to grow it in the soil that existed with the seeds that existed, there was not too much of deviation that would take place in that growing cycle. And this brings us to the to the question of scale, as we scale food processes, as we scale fishing, as we scale education and all of these things, somewhere down the line, the nutrition or the juice of the whole thing gets lost. And it's quite important to note that we are not checking for the proper metrics while scaling this. We want to buy a dozen apples. We don't want to buy a nutritional content from apples. And if we just change that at the time of purchase itself, you would not be growing more and more and more apples as rapidly, but rather you'd be growing more apples that are also more nutritious. Of course, humans always have the tendency to try to make something hyper efficient and then it breaks the cycle. So there would be a point where you take one bite of an apple and it's all the nutrients that you need for a year, and it will overload the body and things like that. But the point is how important it is to have the correct metrics when you're scaling things. Otherwise, it may look like you have perfect products, but it's hollow inside.
That's such a interesting idea because when we're talking about scaling, the whole idea is like what should we be scaling, right? So I think when we come to education and when we come to schooling, what do you think we should be scaling in it? Do we scale the, you know, do we scale the number of schools, or do we scale a program inside the existing number of schools, or do we scale a system that produces people who could then, so I think that's some of the things that people talk about in innovation, right? So
Yeah.
when we are in a product
Let's think about
market,
it.
yeah, it's easy. I mean, if it's a product, it's easy, but when it's a service, how does one scale? Any thoughts on that? I don't know. I'm trying to unbundle that for myself.
Um, yeah, instead of scaling schools, number of teachers, and results, let's scale joy. Part of your assessment needs to be a self-reported child survey about joy that they experience in school, right? Let's scale curiosity. You want to scale curiosity at the size of a state? Let there be an inter-India competition where every state says that our children are going to go and explore the bounds around their school, and we're going to find at least 10 things from our state that are worthy of being put on a national pedestal. 10 fruits from our state that we guarantee no one else has heard of. 10 types of grain from our state or food that we can guarantee no one's ever seen before. And we get to learn things about people. You get to celebrate what you have, but we don't do that. Right? We spend so much of time trying to figure out whether the textbook is perfect, whether there are no spelling mistakes, but we forget to see whether the textbook reaches children on time. And these need to be met. These need to be metrics, like a net promoter score, for instance, needs to enter education, of course, with completely different parameters. Another thing that we can really scale is a sense of self-efficacy. Do our children feel more confident to fail? And a very simple way of measuring this is not checking the number of awards that your school won, but in addition to that, checking the number of kids from your school that have participated in inter-school competitions, that they've had the confidence to step outside of the school and lose and then participate next year, despite that happening, right? And these nuances are, it's just filled everywhere. It's almost like you look in any direction of education and there's a thesis waiting to be produced on that particular aspect if you give it a little more thought. But happy to throw out like random words that you think need to enter the education system, and we could just chat and try to figure out a metric for that.
Yeah, I think scaling the outcome is what we should be looking at. That's so beautiful because at the end of the day, schools are about really human potential and human capacity and, getting kids to be happier and more living more purposeful and meaningful lives. I remember once we were talking on the phone about textbooks, and there was one particular story you said about the rain and textbook. I don't know if you remember that. If you remember that, yeah, I'd love for you to share that particular story about the
Yeah,
before and the after and how you saw. I mean, if you got it, that would be a great share.
yeah, I believe that when textbooks turned color, which by the way was something people had to fight for in the country, and to change from black and white textbooks that looked like newspapers to colored textbooks that looked like magazines, and it was revolutionary, right? Also making textbooks slightly interactive by throwing in an example, and instead of just telling children the information, asking them to go home, ask their parents to take a quick survey. Once all of this started, people we're a little stumped as to how do you measure the success of this, right? Has the textbook contributed to learning? Because if you say the condition of the textbook is really neat, it could mean that either the child has taken very good care of it or has never touched the textbook. Right? So the same indicator could go either way. But I believe someone in the government noticed that before the textbooks were colored, when children would run out in the rain, they would cover their heads with the textbook. But this new generation of textbooks that really appealed to them, when they would run out in the rain, they would protect the textbook from the rain. And that meant whether your textbook was in pristine condition or not, children feel a sense of need to protect this textbook. And it means that something about it really resonated with them and was worth exploring. And these are examples of metrics that I'm talking about. They need to be unconventional, but really measure the final outcome. Right? You don't want a textbook that's totally formatted. You want a textbook that a child protects, right, and engages with. And if that means a fully formatted textbook, then by all means do it. But if a child isn't really bothered about it, do we need to allocate that quantum of budget and attention to such a task? Kind of
Yeah,
like that
that's so
20-80 rule.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, right? Because one is we need to keep looking at different metrics. What are we measuring? What are the indicators? And I think when you're dealing with schools and you're dealing with children, we should be okay with these kind of soft indicators because I think people from corporate start thinking that's too soft an indicate. It has to rain and
But
kids have to be wet, things like that. But it speaks so much.
but why is it a soft indicator?
Well, I'm talking, the reason I use the word a soft indicator is because when you compare it with, let's say, manufacturing or you compare it with these hard industries, I think there you have very clear lab reports or you have tolerances, you have errors, you have these kind of things. But when it comes to education, so much of it is human sciences and human behavior and also human behavior itself changes, right? I remember a story once when you and I were talking. You were you were sharing about this incident in Africa about how somebody, a school principal, takes interviews with teachers or with principals. And there was this one question that they would ask in the interview, and that question would, in some sense, give insight into certain things or certain parts of a person's value system that may become apparent only like 2 3 months post you have joined. And that's what I mean. Do you remember that story? Would you like to expand if you do?
Yeah, the school that you're referring to is in Johannesburg in South Africa, and the principal of the school works in an economically underserved background community, and he would really need the teachers to be able to empathize with the children, be able to also see through them when they weren't communicating really well. And he felt that if I have that expectation out of my teachers, I need to have that expectation out of myself. So he prided himself in occupying the interview seat with the mindset of saying, can I truly understand the person sitting in front of me? And there'd be times when he'd ask them just a really simple question like, how are you? And see how superficial the answer was that came back to him. And let's say it was superficial, like, I'm good and ready to move on. There'll be a follow up question saying, no, this is a really important part of the interview. I genuinely want to know how you are. And would keep probing into that very simple question because one, he genuinely cared how the teacher was, right? What phase of life they were in, what kind of support they needed, everything like that. And he was ready to provide that. And number two, he wanted to see whether the teacher could be honest with themselves and with him, at least in this very specific environment, because if there was absolutely no vulnerability, he seemed to correlate it with a lack of being able to understand what's really going on with the children that the teachers were working with.
Yeah, I imagine, right? Like question that you probably get asked 5 times a day from 5 random people can actually be so, could be a window to the soul, could be an indicator to so many things. And this, I think, if you talk to a seasoned HR person who probably takes like 30 interviews in a day or 50 interviews in a day, and you ask the person, what do you think about this question saying, how are you? He or she may say, hey, that's a soft question. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
A soft indicator. But it's really interesting how all of us need to just go out and curate people with the right mindset. And I think
Yeah.
Jim Collins wrote this book saying "Good to Great," and he spoke about how it's important to get the right people on the bus, and equally important, how to get the right people off the bus, right? So we are now in a time when it might be difficult even to know what do we mean by the right people, right? What is right today? Could there be something like right and wrong at this point in time? I'm sure there is, but so if I'm a principal, if I want to look back at my team and think, hey, do I have the right team, or are we building the right team? What could some of my thinking be? I'm wondering, like, what should some of the questions I should be asking myself? What are some of the observations I need to make? Um, and also, I'm also thinking now that with so much of literature, business literature, corporate literature coming around culture, they say culture eats strategy for breakfast and things like that. So, what does culture look like in a school, or how could culture be solidified, or what could be visible inside culture inside a school?
So let's take this last question about culture and try to answer all the other questions along with it. So for one, culture is something that you feel, you see, things like that, right? And we have these very specific metrics in our mind. Like we were just talking about how we tend to pick pretty bad metrics to measure success, right? So we decide that okay, culture is whether the team's participating in something, right? Culture is whether people are taking ownership. Do we have metrics for culture that are not directly linked to productivity? Because then that would mean that we really care about the person in the first place, right? And there are windows into culture. Who sets the agenda for meetings? Huge window into culture. Right? You say we're a collaborative organization, but is one person setting the agenda? Is that agenda receiving feedback? Right? At meetings, who talks for the majority time? Right? What is the nature of what's said? So you have all these windows that let you really examine and test the culture of an organization on the go, not kind of like a formative assessment, right? Or a check for understanding whether culture is really doing what it's supposed to do, right? And now this comes back to right to the hiring process. If you're upset with an education system that asked you questions that you felt were unnecessary, are you asking the people who you're interviewing questions that are unnecessary? Like, for instance, are you asking people whether they're here for the short term or the long term? People have a tendency to lie about something like this because employers tend to show a bias towards hiring people for the long term, right? How about we talk about our organization has great culture and we actually put that in action to create opportunities that are both short term and long term for people that are joining the organization so that someone can be honest and tell you, hey, I'm here for the short term, and you can still have a role for that person who want to hire them because that's the nature of the job that you created. And you see these windows of culture into everything. So how do you set up a right team, one, have good culture and put it into practice, put it into practice in the hiring process? Then once people are on your team, let them know that it's okay if they have to leave, right? Let them know that you'll have their back, that you'll invest in them, and you really care about their success. Because I personally believe if a person leaves an organization on good terms, you've added something to their life, right? You've contributed in some way. They've been now eligible for a better opportunity. And that's also the work that you're doing, not just your final product, right? Building a team is a very core part of your work, especially if you're in the development sector or if you're a school, right? And yeah, some people will always leave on bad terms and some people will always take you for granted, but it's not fair to treat the rest of the world like those people. And then it finally comes into the point that you made about people getting off the bus. And I know you meant it more as a people volunteer to get off the bus more than mass layoff. But I had a talk with someone who ran an organization with more than 10,000 people. And that blew my mind because there are so many complexities that emerge when you have an organization that big. So I asked him a silly question, what's the right attrition rate? And he told me there's no right attrition rate, but zero is definitely the wrong attrition rate, right? It means because you're becoming a totally people-pleasing organization, especially when you're working with 10,000 people. If your team has like two people, it's a different story. But if you aren't creating the conditions that let people level up and leave and have new people come in, then you're doing something wrong as an organization, and it's worth questioning what that is.
Yeah, that's so cool. Like I think, yeah, the target is never zero. I think the ideal space is never zero. I think challenge needs to always be there, you know. I was listening to somebody yesterday who was talking about the difference between dukh and sangharsh. So sangharsh is very important. The challenge is going to be there. I mean, and it's also about suitability and it's about circumstantial behaviors and so many things. It's about alignment and things. But I'm currently working on a culture deck actually for the organization that I support. I'm trying to see how I can put it out there, how I can vocalize it, and how we can really change behaviors and actions. And I think these actions need not be changed as much as the reactions to these actions. You know, oh, did you see what he did? Oh my God, did you see what he did? Amazing. It's about the reaction that we need to change. It's about the response that I think we need to change. I think the difference between two people, their reactions or their responses to the same incident is probably depicts a little bit more about the culture that they're used to and things like that. So yeah, it's almost been 35 minutes. What a great call we had. Is there anything that you wanna talk about or anything comes to your mind? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I
I
listened
don't want to be the
to
one who just like says, let's stop.
I listened to a talk I think between Adam Grant and Sam Altman, and Adam asked Sam whether he had any questions for him, and Sam said, "Okay, when you're working in an organization that's on the cutting edge of things, when you're really trying to figure things out, it can be overwhelming for people because their sense of possibility just blows right through the roof." For some reason, made me think about you, and you've been doing a lot of talks in the space of AI, and you've been coming across so many different tools and software and products that could potentially completely change the face of education. How do you feel about that? Does it overwhelm you? Do you try it out for your own learning in addition to your school?
Yeah, I mean, never in history for me was I being at the receiving end of so many updates so soon. Um, I'm used to getting updates once in 6 months or once in a year.
Yeah,
You're getting updates like every week, boom, 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 right? It's just coming. It's like waves hitting a shore, you know. So two things happen. One, you start wondering with the new update that I got today, like, and when I say a new update, it could be a new app, it could be a new feature, it could be a new LLM model, it could be a new way of doing things, it could be a new process, it could be whatever. I mean, earlier I was super excited about learning it, seeing it, playing with it. And then I started thinking, hey, next week I'm going to get a better update anyway, which is going to make this obsolete. So do I really even need to, you know? So earlier there used to be massive FOMO that I need to like you need to get on top of every update in order for you to be able to appreciate the latest update. So you needed to do Windows, 95, Windows 2000, Windows NT, whatever, So because
yeah,
things build on top of each other, but in the AI world, nothing seems to be building on top of each other. They're just building a whole different thing.
yeah,
So from that perspective, yes, I'm a little overwhelmed, but it also pushes me into starting to think that they're doing their job, and by that I mean they're developing. They're constantly developing. They're constantly innovating. They're constantly creating solutions, products. But what we need to do as educationists, or rather, what I am doing, is to try and ask myself, what is enough, right? Because we don't need everything that's cutting edge to solve the problems that we have right now. We need to understand, like I'm asking myself, this is enough to solve this problem, right? I don't need to get another technology to solve the same problem, right? If this is solving the problem, it's solving the problem, right? And that for me, I think is quite interesting because then I am not constantly on the lookout for new things. Right? Because if you're constantly on the lookout for new things, then you might not actually implement anything and you might not take the effort to watch it grow or to let it seep or permeate into, every level of the organization. You may be waiting for Christmas or waiting for Superman. But what I'm realizing is that we need to find the minimum viable thing, fix it, move forward, and help everybody become more comfortable with it, because AI is a revolution for sure. It doesn't look like it. It probably looks like another app, another software, another website. But I think it's a technological revolution. And I was listening to Professor Sugata Mitra's talk last night, and he was talking about for the first time in a very long time, people have actively used a machine or a technology without understanding how it works at all. His analogy was, do you understand how a steam engine works? And most people say, yeah, there's a piston, there's a boiler, and water. They have some understanding of how a steam engine works. Or do you understand how like an internal combustion engine works? They have some understanding. They understand the components, they understand the sequence, they understand what makes it work. They understand the theory of that machine. But if you ask someone who's been using ChatGPT or DeepSeek or whatever, or Gemini, if you ask them, how does this work? Most likely they don't have an answer of how does it work. That means the technology has been developed so beautifully and so seamlessly, and it's so inviting and so easy, like the UI of it or the UI. Everything is so easy that people have been able to accept and adopt it without even wanting to know how it works. You see? So
That's a really interesting point that you brought up because I love when people feel like they know something, and the moment when it's unearthed that you actually didn't know much about that, right? You thought you did, some misconception went around, right? That moment, that feeling where you need to question everything again, and that childhood curiosity just gets pulled out of people, right? And the uh, I feel like the first time that happened to me was when I found out how trees grow. Do you, for instance, can you describe how a tree grows?
yeah, I mean, there's a seed, and from that stage, the seed goes into the soil. The soil needs to be fertile, it needs to have the right nutrients, and then there's a little germination, and that comes through, and then there's a little more this, and then, the animation of that seed growing into a tree comes true. And if there's a misconception, blame the textbook, my friend.
Yeah, and where does that mass of the tree come from?
Where is the mass of the tree coming? It's the energy that it's getting from the soil and the nutrition that it's getting from the soil, isn't it? And isn't that getting converted into
So
into
prepare to have your childhood curiosity get rekindled again, right?
tell
Because
me, tell me, Jonathan.
so the bulk of the tree is carbon, and the carbon that the plant consumes is not as much from the soil as it is from the air. So the plant breathes in the CO2, takes energy, splits the CO2 into its carbon and to its oxygen, rejects the oxygen, takes the carbon, and implants it into the tree structure. So, in fact, a tree is technically being 3D printed down from air and is not getting its mass from the soil. And I'm pretty sure bulk of humanity wouldn't think of it that way, right? So I feel quite often we believe that we know something. We have this illusion of learning, and then we run with it. And I like to disagree with Sugata a little bit and say that it's a lot more apparent with AI, where you can ask one question and the person says, "I don't know." However, if 10 people gave incorrect answers, those incorrect answers would start propagating as how AI works. And then people would have an answer, but it would be the incorrect one. Right? So I think we need to start thinking about understanding as honesty more than response. Because if someone responds, we think that they think that they know, but in reality, we got to just ask ourselves like
I,
children.
I love the way you put that, because next time you find a Gen Z super intelligent, smart, young kid who comes up and
You're
says,
going to
"Oh,
ask that.
the tree was downloaded off the internet. It got upgraded over the air." He's probably right. He's probably right, because I remember how germination of a seed is taught in second standard or third standard, I think, and how there's a line right in the middle of that frame. It says sky and and soil, and I remember one of the educational researchers telling me that 90% of all the misconceptions come from textbooks, because textbooks are could be designed by designers who are graphic designers who are not who don't have the background of education, and so they may pick up a clip art or they may pick up a drawing because they come from creative schools. They come from schools which teach them to be creative visualizers and not actual, yeah, representatives of reality. So it's so interesting from what you said. That's certainly it certainly blew my mind. I only buy white cars because white cars don't get hot. What do you think about that? Tell me, oh Jonathan.
But by the way, my battery is at 10%, so just wanted
Let's
to call
use
that
it
out.
wisely. Okay.
No, but more than the car example, there's so much of basic physics, right, which is in the physical world, which we should know, which we should be excited by, but we still have the misconception that we understand. For instance, you can never really touch two objects together because while we think they're touching together, there's that little bit of space that is preventing them from touching with each other. When an object really touches, electrons would be colliding with each other, new bonds would be forming, and all sorts of things would take place. So, in fact, the chair that you're sitting on, you're not really sitting on. There's this microscopic gap, and you're levitating on the chair that you're sitting on. The world is just filled with so many interesting examples, which, like you're right. Quite often, a textbook tells it to us, or sometimes a news article, or sometimes just an adult who has very low expectations from us. Like when an adult tells you that ice is slippery. Technically, ice is not slippery. Ice is very much a solid, but when you stand on ice, right, you put pressure onto the ice. And ice, unlike other solids, when it freezes, it expands. So when you put pressure on it and you contract it, you're undoing the freezing process and you're converting that solid ice into water. And water is slippery. Ice is not slippery, right? And we just go through life throwing out these random statements and a feeling of understanding. But my point is not to say that everyone's foolish. I'm saying my point is that I know these few examples because I asked these few questions, and there are millions and millions of more examples that I never bothered to ask a question about and need to reflect about and think about, right? But it's just a thought to ask ourselves whether we really know something and whether we can withstand the 10 whys that children ask us when we try to explain it to them.
There's so much more to know and learn. But thanks, Jonathan. What an incredible conversation we had. Almost 46 minutes. We need to save a little bit of juice on your phone so that we can upload this video. But thanks once again. And we should do this more often. Maybe we should pick up newspaper articles and
Yeah.
talk about it.
Yeah, casual conversation like last week tonight. We should
Mhm.
do that like a weekly summary of the
Yeah.
education sector.
Absolutely. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for hosting.
You just need to hit stop.
So,
And
do I hit leave?